Good evening and welcome to another appointment in this cycle of international video conferences dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Tonight's presentation comes from down under. Indeed, Mike Mellor from New Zealand will talk about the history of transportation in Wellington, the capital of the country. This presentation will be done in English. At the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in every moment during the presentation. I remind you that a complete program of the forthcoming presentation is available on our internet site on English section. Thank you. And I remind you that next presentation will be the last before the summer break on a Tuesday, 27th of June, and will be dedicated to tramways in Krakow, Poland. For giving the floor to Mike, I repeat everything in Italian. Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a questo altro appuntamento in questo ciclo di videoconferenze internazionali dedicato ai tram e non solo. Questa sera la presentazione viene dall'altro capo del mondo, da Wellington, capitale della Nuova Zelanda, da dove Mike Mellor ci parlerà della storia del trasporto pubblico appunto di Wellington. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese e alla fine della serata ci sarà il consueto spazio a disposizione per eventuali domande in inglese o in italiano, ma potete anche usare la chat quando volete durante la presentazione. Il programma completo delle presentazioni è disponibile sul nostro sito internet. Vi ricordo che la prossima presentazione tra 2 settimane, martedì 27 giugno, sarà l'ultima prima della pausa estiva e sarà dedicata ai tram di Cracovia, Polonia. Grazie e ora do la parola a Mike. Thank you. The floor now goes to Mike. Mike, please.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Buonasera. Good evening. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm starting with this slide because it seems to me it encapsulates quite a few of the things about transport in Wellington. It's this is the end of Seatoon Tunnel, built in 1906, with the pony and trap which replaced it. You can see the suburb of Seatoon in front of you with hardly any buildings there, and the enterprise of the Edwardian pioneers in building lots of tunnels, as I will talk about, to get to places that were essentially barely occupied. Seatoon was then mainly just holiday homes, and it had only been accessible by road for a few years. Before that time, sea was the main way of getting to and from the place. The topography of Wellington will feature largely in this talk because that determined a lot of things. So will, for better or worse, politics, because they come heavily into the picture. First of all, now, where is New Zealand? Well, this is a map showing the world on one side and the Antipodes on the other. And New Zealand is that funny little green-shaped blob that's normally the other way up. We're about, if I dug a hole from where I am now, I'd emerge just northwest of Madrid. So Buenos noches to pick anybody from Spain. So we're in a similar sort of latitude to Italy, and a similar sort of shape to Great Britain. And for those of you who haven't been to Wellington or New Zealand, this is where Wellington stands in the middle of the country, and it's in the middle of the country for transport reasons. The capital, the modern day capital, was initially Auckland, but that's so difficult to get to. People would take weeks or months to get there because the only means of transport was by sea. There was no land transport link through the North Island until 1908. So a bit of history for those who aren't familiar. Many of you seem to be familiar with New Zealand. New Zealand's a very young country. It's only been inhabited for about 1,000 years by the Maori, who came from the South Pacific. But urbanization, which of course is an essential part of city transport, started happening after the British colonization. In Wellington, that started in 1840. It was a private venture. It wasn't a government venture. It was done by some rogues and vagabonds who were people of dubious character, but encouraged people to come out to the other side of the world. And the city started being built in 1840. They built it in the wrong place, first of all, discovered it was a floodplain and have to move it across to the other side of the harbour. The Wellington became the capital in 1865, and the urbanisation then proceeded quite fast. It was only 13 years later that the first steam tram opened, and that's from it opened from Thorndon in the north, through to Newtown in the south, through the city centre. This area, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. The city centre is here. This was a relevant point is that this line was approximately where the waterfront was in 1840. So all this land to the east has been developed. So been reclaimed. This is the steam trams. There were 8 steam locos from Merryweather. They all went by names. There was Wellington, there was Victoria, there was Zealandia. But it was not a success. The complaints that I think steam trams everywhere probably had, noise, smoke, etc., were quite vociferous, and there's some smoke coming out of a tram in front of one of the major buildings of Wellington that's still there today. That's the old government buildings, reputed to be the largest wooden building in the Southern Hemisphere. That's entirely wood. And at the time, it housed the entire New Zealand government, grown slightly larger since. So in 1882, the steam trams were withdrawn and replaced by horses. Just a comment, I'll be showing a few of these maps. The dates on the maps are the dates for which that network applied. That doesn't mean to say the horse trams ran until 1901. They actually ran until 1904, but there were changes happening in 1902, which we'll come to. The steam tram and the horse tram were both 1067mm gauge, 3'6" in imperial measurements. Which is the same gauge that the New Zealand Railways had eventually chosen after various trials with other gauges. So which made a lot of sense. So there's the same depot with horse trams there. The site of the depot had been rebuilt. And the most recent building on the site was demolished a few years ago, and they excavated the foundations and found the foundations of the tram depot still there, which was quite exciting, but they've now been covered up by a new building. But the trams succumbed to electric shock in 1904. And part of the reason for that was the whole successful either. And the city council came to the rescue in 1900 and bought the operation. So the municipalisation, which was a common trend in many places, started in Wellington in 1900 and continued until not so long ago. One of the after the trams, the first development was a cable car up into the hills. Wellington is defined by its hills. When we get to the next map, I'll go run through a bit about the topography, but it's everywhere is ridges or plateaus. And to get up onto the hill, this particular hill, a cable car was built quite a structure for the early 1900s, with the 3 tunnels, 2 big viaducts, and it's still running today. And it was important enough that the Prime Minister was there at the opening. That gentleman at the left with the hat and the stick is Richard Seddon, commonly called King Dick, who was a very well-known figure in New Zealand history. The cable car was quite an interesting operation. It was a combination, a cross between a funicular and a cable car. It had a continuous haulage rope, to which, and a grip man. You can see the grip man standing in the middle. But it stopped and started not by releasing the grip, but by the cable stopping and starting. And for the journey, the downhill car was connected to the cable for the entire trip. The uphill car wasn't. And so the haulage cable pulled the downhill car down, and there was a tail rope connecting the 2 cars, which hauled the uphill car up. Quite a complicated procedure. They're also very conscious of safety, and in between the rails, there is a 3rd rail sticking up there, just visible. There was a fell brake that operated on that. The fell system, best known in this part of the world anyway, for the Rimataka incline and on the railway line through the hills to the Wairarapa to the east of Wellington, which operated until 1955. And was on for both haulage and braking, and was also used for braking on a couple of coal lines in the South Island too. So it was belt and braces, because there was also a track brake. You can see the track brake block there, but no, better safe than sorry. And this is the powerhouse at the top. The powerhouse building still exists. It's now a cable car museum, which we'll talk about later. And there were 2 early cable cars. The 3rd one came along, and they ran until the 1970s. They ran with trailers, and those trailers were original horse car trailers. So they operated from the 1880s until 1974, I think it was. So quite long-lived, but we'll get to that part of the story later. And this is the downhill terminus on what's called the Golden Mile, which is the main route through the city between the railway station area and Courtney Place at the southeastern end, which I'll show on the next map. So here is the next map. So that's the cable car. That was also 3-foot-6 gauge, very sensible. Just a note about topography before we get go into the details of the electric trams. Wellington is ridges and plateaus. There's a ridge along this peninsula. This peninsula was in fact an island until earthquake in 1400 and something, which raised the isthmus here. There's another ridge. And there's a tunnel through the bottom. There's a tunnel there. The thickened line show tunnels. So there's a tunnel built for trams primarily, but for general traffic as well through the tunnel there. All these tunnels were built in the early 1900s. This is another ridge here, and Wellington's most prominent peak, called Mount Victoria, is on top there. It features in quite a few of the photographs. And there's a tunnel through there, which is a single track tunnel for trams only, then for trolley buses, and it's still used by buses, but by no other traffic. Then all this area is all a high plateau. The tram lines are all quite curvy because they have to climb hills, and there's another tunnel there. It's hard to see because of the curves. That's the Karori tunnel, heading up towards here, which is reputed to be the largest suburb in New Zealand. And the only significantly flat routes run on north-south axis through to Island Bay in the south. There's a bit of a summit there and heading northwards to the outer suburbs of Wellington to the rest of the country. Just a note about what I mean by Wellington. Wellington city stretches to the north from here, but that's never had tram or trolleybus transport, largely because of the topography and also because of the sparsity of settlement. So when I'm talking about Wellington, I mean stopping there and not going beyond. That's a restricted area of operation is actually one of the factors in the decline of the trolleybus system. So the electric tram started in 1904, and by 1907 it had got to quite an extent. They built it very quickly, and it required a lot of building, because one of the odd things they did was they changed the gauge. Instead of being 3'6", they went to 4 foot, and they had their experts visited Britain, and they, some reason, decided that 4 foot was the gauge of the future. The reasoning is a bit obscure. It may be that they did it to make sure that there wouldn't be through running with the main line railway, on the similar principle, as I understand, that happened to BART in San Francisco, where it was built to a broader gauge to avoid that sort of takeover by another operator. There had been a proposal for a steam tram running through on the railway up to Lower Hutt, which is off to the north, in the late 1870s, but that came to naught. But the spectre of that might have been hanging over the design of the system. The railway station that the railway stations, the railway station history is unbelievably complicated in Wellington, so I won't go into that in any detail, but that's that area there with the railway heading out here. And there were further complication. There was 2 railways. There was a government railway and a private railway called the Wellington and Manawatu. They are not of any great significance for the tram network generally, except that they were a destination, obviously, for potential passengers. So we have, that's the system as it first expanded to, and that's an early tram, but there was heavy and British design in the involvement in the system. A fairly typical looking double-decker. The early cars of Wellington are incredibly complicated. There were lots of different designs built by lots of different people at lots of different times. So you will forgive me if I don't go into too much detail, to some extent, because I don't really understand it. It's something I think you need to study from your early years, and I never had that opportunity. But this is built by the British Electric Car Company, and the double-deckers operated until quite late in the system at Island Bay Terminus, which is the most southern terminus of the network. And there are also bigger double bogie trams. They were called Big Bens because they were big, and as you can see, they carried a lot of passengers. A feature of many of Wellington's early trams was that they were compartment style, in the manner of traditional British railway carriages, and which took a lot of people, but there was a safety risk with conductors who had to go along the boards to collect the fares, and because of that, they were banned by Act of Parliament in 1913. So all the cars of this sort of design, which became known as a palace type, had to be rebuilt as open saloons. A selection of trams. Number 42 there was a combination car that had been rebuilt from a palace. I think there were various combination cars there. Someone who knows more about it than I do could probably be able to tell you where they all from. But you can see there was a wide variety. And this is another palace, once again, rebuilt, another bogie. They discovered they needed the bogies for the capacity. That's outside the first electric tram depot, which was in Newtown, but long demolished. And this is about the third version of the government railway station. A bit later, the tram in the foreground have been rebuilt from a palace type car. So this is the northern end of what's called the Golden Mile, running through towards Courtney Place, with the trams running away from us southwards, and the harbour to the left. The building in the middle is the old custom house, which has been demolished, and the rather fancy building on the right was the headquarters of the railways department. I've shown this picture not because of though that was a significant event, and a passenger got killed by a runaway tram, but to show the sort of engineering that was needed to get through to the suburbs. This is a tram heading up to the plateau at Brooklyn, where the only way to get there was to build a private right-of-way, and through cuttings across embankments, massive amounts of earthworks. It was a really significant undertaking, building the trams in Wellington. And that was later broadened to provide a road, which is still there, still the main link to Wellington. And this helps show the sort of landscape that was being traversed. That's the city centre in the back left, and Mount Victoria, I mentioned earlier, is the peak in the background. So the city extended on the flat and started going up the hills. The tram was obviously a significant incentive for building, and the rather grim-looking building there is a rather grim-looking building. That was the prison, which has long since demolished. This is another line, the line up to Wadestown, taken rather later with a double saloon, which became Wellington's standard tram. And this was built on a private right-of-way. The general traffic wasn't allowed on here until after the trams had closed, with the major cuttings. So there was a lot of, in the Wellington suburbs, if you discover a flat piece of land, it's nearly always been created by fill from the cuttings. There's the landscape has been transformed. So the next snapshot we're going to look at on the map is in the 1930s, when Wellington had established its first trolleybus in the north end of the city there. The reason for that, the reason it wasn't a tram, is because it ran parallel to the main railway line, and there was a restriction on what you could do to competition with the railway. So the solution was a single trolleybus, AEC 601, with a body built in Auckland, running from the tram depot. So it was really designed to be a connecting service. And this is, the previous building was the depot, which you can see here, with the trolleybus. That is the trolleybus running along here, and the trams going through to the town centre there. And the other transport features of note are all this smoke is where the Wellington and Manawatu private railway station was, and this is the line to the government railway station around there, and two lines ran in parallel for some distance heading north. All this area has now been reclaimed and is where the port is. But this street is still identifiable as such, and that's Mount Victoria again in the background. And it was integrated as part of the tramway system. This is a standard type of New Zealand transport ticket, commonly in latter days commonly called a 10-trip ticket, because you clipped it. The driver or the conductor clipped it every time until you got 10 trips. This is a 12-trip, which would have been in the days of the 6-day week. And the through ticketing between modes is something that was obviously thought important then and vanished and wasn't reintroduced until electronic ticketing about 15 years ago. You'll note the term trackless. That trolleybuses were still called trackless by the City Council even after the Second World War. Another example of the sort of terrain that had to be negotiated. This is the Karori tram route, which was one of the early routes, and the tram route comes up from the city here and goes round in a big loop here and ends up here, and then heads off through a tunnel there, through the Karori tunnel there. This rather rickety looking bridge was replaced by a concrete one in the 30s, I think. And these are a typical looking Wellington hill suburb with wooden houses perched in the most extraordinary places, with paths going up all sorts of goat tracks. I used to live in a house just down below here, and it was quite an effort to get to and from to your front door. And this is the other end of the tunnel, the Karori tunnel. And the Karori tram route is the one going along here. Once again, the major earthworks. This is just a road. And this is a substation for the trams. And this is the Northern tram route, which was built in 1925. And that's Northern Tunnel, which was opened then. So they were still building tunnels, extending the system for some time. And this cut into the side of the hill, this has all been filled now. This is completely flat here. You wouldn't know that there had been a big depression there, a big gully there, but you would know that that concrete brick wall is still there, and both the tunnels are still there, still being used by buses and other traffic. And something else happening in the 1920s was the development of the workshop and depot. This is the suburb of Kilbirnie, which is on the isthmus that was created by the earthquake when the land in the background ceased to be an island. The original part of the depot is here, extended this bit here, and it's still in use by one of the current bus operators. The tram routes are along here to the south coast at Isle Bay, and along here to Miramar and Seatoun through the Seatoun tunnel, which isn't visible here. And one of the reasons it's not visible here is this hill no longer exists. The whole thing was bulldozed to make way for the airport in the 1950s. This is the government power station, which supplied electricity. It replaced the original corporation power station, which was in the city centre. And as one of the previous pictures was typical of the hilly Wellington housing, this is typical of flat Wellington housing. Single-storey wooden houses on the archetypical size is a quarter-acre section, but these aren't. Quarter-acre is about 1,000 square meters. These are obviously a lot smaller than that. And this is Kilbirnie from the other direction. Wellington's main seaside resort at the time. Lots of people there. There are 4 or 5 trams along there. In the official description of the National Library of New Zealand, which it came from, they called them trolley buses, which is a bit premature. That is the tram barns, that's the power station, and that's where the airport's going to be. The tram route terminated in a loop here. The trolleybus routes replaced it, came further down here and around the coast, and we'll see a picture of the terminus there later. This is Mount Victoria again, and the Hittite trolleybus went through there later on in a loop. So there was a lot of climbing involved, perfectly suited for electric. The west of the city was rural and continues to be rural. So this was not a common scene, but it happened. This is sheep coming up before the age of large stock trucks being driven down Glenmore Street in Wellington that's a tram from Karori behind, and with the Botanic Garden behind the wall there, which is still a major attraction. This is Courtney Place, the southern end of the Golden Mile, and this shows not merely the layout there, but also the types of trams. The main type of Wellington tram, which was a double saloon, a similar sort of layout to the W class in Melbourne. The right-hand one on the number 3 route is the first style of double saloon, with the separate destination indicator and an open centre section. The second style was this rather more streamlined one, which was essentially the same, different in detail, and they lasted as the mainstay of the fleet through to the closure of the system. We can date this picture to 1936 because the film showing at the cinema that started as the Deluxe and then became the Embassy and was the scene of one of the Lord of the Rings world premieres, where this was all covered in red carpet. What's showing there is a film called Satan Meets Lady, which starred Betty Davis. I don't think I've ever seen it. Just to give an indication of some of the gradients being faced, this is a double saloon tram at the city entrance to the Hittite tram tunnel. Just about, that's the wing walls for the portal there. But what came along in the 1930s was, as we talked about in the chat before the talk started, were the fiducia trams, which was the future of tramways. Typical of many places, going for modern streamlined trams when the future was seen to be trams. And in contrast to the British experience, this actually was the future of trams. This wasn't just a prototype. This was the precursor of a small fleet, which continued to be built until the 1950s. And as it says, ride with us and ride in comfort. And you still can. The trams also in the early days ran a freight and parcel service with 2 trams like this one. That parcel service didn't last for that long, and this one was converted into a track grinder and still exists. The fiducia behind is emerging from the city portal of the Hittite tunnel, which is a pretty tight fit, but was still used, well, is still used by buses. There's one tunnel that wasn't built in connection with the trams, but I've illustrated it here because it was used by trolleybuses for a while, no longer. That's the Mount Victoria tunnel, which goes underneath, you guessed it, Mount Victoria. This is in the 30s. with the two double saloon trams in the front. They're going around the Basin Reserve, which any cricketing fans, I suspect, would have heard of. It's supposed to be one of the world's best cricket pitches and also supposed to be one of the world's largest roundabouts. It wasn't then. The trams ran around just the eastern side of it. It's called the Basin Reserve because it was an area of marshland that was planned to build a dock on, but Mother Nature had different ideas. And in 1855, an earthquake raised the whole land around here and drained the swamp. So it became a cricket pitch. There's still a legal relic of that time in the boulevard, if you can call it that, with the roads leading into the central city, Kenton, Cambridge Terrace. The strip of grass down the middle. Can someone turn their microphone off, please?
Kannst auch einfach abschalten.
Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, the central strip in the dual carriageway is still legally called the Canal Reserve, though it never was one and never will be one. So by 1940, the system was its maximum extent. This was the last significant piece built, a bypass called the Western Approaches, going up to Karori, which is this route here. The cable car is still going strong, but there was another event that was happening in 1940, which caused loops to be built here and sidings to be built here and a loop to be built there, which was a major exhibition on the commemorating the centenary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty between Maori chiefs and representatives of Queen Victoria, which is nowadays seen as the foundation stone for the modern New Zealand state. So looking at the tram extension first, this is Bowen Street coming up from the city centre with the tram route well underway there. More excavation, more infill. The original route, the route it was shortcut to, on which this double saloon is, went down here and round here, and the other side of this rather fine building, which is Parliament Buildings. Once again, we've got Mount Victoria in the background, and then the Miramar Peninsula that had been the island behind that, and the harbour entrance is through here with the ranges with the Wairarapa to the east behind them.
Excuse me, Mike. I'm afraid we can't see your cursor at the moment.
Oh, can't you? Oh, sorry. I will talk about it, and I'll describe it instead. Thank you for pointing that out. This is the Centennial Exhibition, and it was a really major event. The population of Wellington, sorry, population of New Zealand was 1.6 million. In the 6 months this exhibition was open, from late 1939 to mid 1940, there were 2.6 million visitors, which strikes me as being quite impressive. And obviously there wouldn't be many international ones in the beginning of a war from a remote country. This is once again in the suburb of Kilbirnie. There's the tram depot behind, and the two roads on the right-hand side where the tram routes went. The left-hand one over the top of the hill, the right-hand one eventually through the tunnel. And this was one of the loops built for the exhibition. The double saloon has just arrived from the city, and the fiducia on the left is heading into town from Miramar or Seatoon. And an important event that happened just after the war was the City Council bought the cable car. So the municipal transport extended and became part of the network. Again, this is a similar sort of 10 trip, 12 trip type ticket, but an interesting feature is it's on weekdays it was a 12 trip, but on Sundays it was a 6 trip. That the fare was on Sundays was twice the fare on weekdays. That may reflect the fact that the cable car was and still is a tourist attraction. It's largely kept going by cruise ships, which meant that COVID was a real problem for it. Immediately after the war, the city council decided that it would have a long-term aim of replacing the trams with trolleybuses. And this was the second extension of the trolleybus. The first one was on Oriental Parade. We'll see that in a few slides' time. This is a one that was built purely for access to an office building. The Social Security building in central Wellington. Wellington was New Zealand was a pioneer on social security and the welfare state. Burnt down and had to be replaced with an emergency building some distance from the city centre, remotely between the railway yards and the port. On the top right of the picture, there's the portholes of a ship. So a trolleybus route was laid on to provide for the workers, and it was the only Y terminus. So the trolleybus nearest us is leaving from the Y. The one furthest us is just about to reverse into it. These are the original fleet of Crossley trolleybuses, which are quite a rare breed, but the same body style was used by subsequent BUTs. And you may recall we earlier had a picture of trams heading up to Wadestown. Well, this is one of the Crossleys heading up to Wadestown, but on the road that has been rebuilt as a road. Sorry, the tram track that's been built as a road. The conversion took some time because of that. There was a long pause between the tram stopping and the trolleybuses starting. But just an aside on that, in the Oriental Parade ones, the trams and the trolleybuses coexisted for some time. The trolleybuses extended up into the hills. The Karori routes, which we'll come to in a minute, changed overnight. The trams stopped one day and the trolleybuses started the next. But when you come to the Newtown Park route, that took over 20 years to turn from trams to trolleybuses. And this is the same Wadestown route. This is heading up past the Parliament buildings that we saw the back of in the earlier picture. The trams are clearly still there, the wires and the rails. So this would have been taken about 1950. Behind the trolleybus is the then residence of the Governor General. The Governor General is the monarch's representative in New Zealand. That she, as she currently is, has now moved out to Newtown, and the building called the Beehive has been built there, which is the New Zealand Executive Government building. I think this is on the Karori route, and which all the tram infrastructure was still there when the trolleybus route opened. So they had to rebuild it afterwards, and not ideal territory for running a trolleybus through, I wouldn't have thought. A particular feature there is that the trams and trolleybuses had good facilities for carrying prams and shopping, and the recess at the back of the bus has got a pram in it. There were similar recesses on the sides of trams and trolleybuses, and hooks on the front of some to carry prams. It will be a bit more difficult having that sort of recess on a rear-engined, low-floor bus. So then the conversion routes proceeded apace. The Oriental Parade route is the one immediately east of the city centre harbour, the one that ends in a point and then heads southwards. The southwards bit was an extension beyond the original tram route. The Wagetown route is the one right at the top. The Karori route is the one to the left. The route to Brooklyn is the one down towards the south to the left of the blue continuing tram line, which was extended beyond the tram to Mornington and eventually to Kingston. And on the right, there are the routes to the eastern suburbs. A significant change there was that the airport had been built. The runways there running north-south. So the road which they used to follow was buried under the tarmac, and the trolley buses were diverted around the northern end of the runway. Quite a significant factor in the demise of the routes to this part of the city. There's a pedestrian subway on the line of the road there, and it's reputed that the tram rails are still there, buried. We had earlier had the view over Lyle Bay. That's where the right-hand blue line joins the sea at the opposite side of the bay from the airport. We saw the picture of the Mount Victoria tunnel being constructed. The trolley buses ran through there initially because the Hataitai tunnel, which runs parallel to the north, which is the tram only one, was still being used by trams. So for 10 years or so, no, perhaps not as long as that, the trolley buses ran through the Mount Victoria tunnel as a regular route, and they still continued to run peak hour routes until the 1980s. The building on the right is the ventilation building for the tunnel, and the tunnel still exists as part of the country's main highway, State Highway 1, though there are plans to change that, which we will touch on later on. So we're now the period when trams and trolleys shared the streets. This is Manners Street along the Golden Mile with that's one of these. There were 4 batches of BUT trolley buses, and that's one of the second batch. The first and last had lantern windscreens. The middle 2 had flat fronts like that one. And behind it, there's a queue of an early type of double saloon, and then a fiducia, and then a later type of double saloon. I'm not quite sure what happens behind that. And you'll notice the sophistication of the towing device. I'm not quite sure why the trolley bus has got its poles up, but never mind. And this is Courtney Place at the other end, once again in the transition period with both trolley wires and tram wires, and there's a fiducia waiting to head south or east. This has been extensively remodeled and is probably about to be remodeled today. One of the things I'm going to be doing later today is going to a council meeting where proposals for submissions on proposals to turn this into a pedestrian priority area are being discussed. And this is the railway station with a selection of BUTs. Those are 2 ones nearest to both the second type of second order of BUTs, with a fiducia heading to Newtown on what became the last tram route. And this wouldn't have been far off. The building in the back is a wing of the railway station, and this is that pile. At the time, it was the largest building in New Zealand, and it's probably the building that's had the highest footfall, with the number of commuters running through it every day since 1937, when it opened to replace both the government and what had been private railway stations. It took a long time for them to combine. It was 30 years after they were amalgamated before they were put on the same site. And this is one of the last type of BUTs with the lantern windscreen. And the fine building behind it, the clock tower, is something that's earthquake related as well. That clock used to be on the town hall, which had a tower, and after Wairarapa earthquake in the 1940s was demolished and the clock removed to this Art Deco building. And then we come to 1964, which is the end of the tram system. We're outside Government House again, with a fiducia in good nick. A good fiducia, as it says, was preserved at Motat. The line to Wadestown went up to the right, and the 1940 line to Karori went almost directly behind, straight up the hill there to Karori, to the right of the that's the Wellington cenotaph there. And the last day, crowds turned out, and there may well be people attending here who are actually there. I know quite a few people who were at the commemoration of the last tram day. It was an event. The last tram in New Zealand until the Christchurch tram appeared in recent years. So by 1964, so in 1964, the last trams went and the trolley buses started. The system was still being extended, which is why this map stops at 1984, because there were extensions beyond that. The tunnel addition since the last map I showed you is that there are now 2 parallel tunnels going through Mount Victoria, the northern tram one and the southern one, which we just saw in the picture with the general traffic, which is no longer used by public transport. So that's one of the final BUTs in its final livery, with a squiggly W as the Wellington City Transport, which also reminds me of the Greater Manchester squiggly M. But there were things happening apart in the transport field, not just on the public transport. Here's the inner city motorway being built, and the poor little cable car in the middle, still with its trailer, which was converted from a palace-style horse tram, trundling through while the motorway gets built over the top into a tunnel at the back, in the background. You can date the picture because the graffiti there says Forster with a swastika on it, and Forster was the then president of South Africa, still in the apartheid era. And a colour picture of the same, showing the style of the trailer, which had been around. This would be in the early 70s, which had been around since the 1880s. And in the background, the notch in the background is where Island Bay is, where the Southern Tram went to, and the tower that you can see is as Wellington's War Memorial, Carillion. Put this picture in to show 2 things. These are the final days of the cable car. The cable car doesn't have a trailer. The trailers were withdrawn in 1974 as a safety issue. So the cable cars operated on their own after that. But this also shows integrated transport. The bus on the right is a city council bus connecting with the city council owned cable car, a facility which no longer exists. And there are tracks running in front of us. They led to a back shunt, which led into the cable car shed, where there is still a cable car in the Cable Car Museum, and one of life's little annoyances is that the cable car on display in the museum is facing the wrong way. Its uphill end is at the far end when the uphill end should be at the near end, and yeah. And this is the cable car in its last days as in its original setup. This would be at the Salamanca Road stop, which is the stop for the university, and people hanging off the cars. There were you could kick the side of the tunnel with your feet from sitting on the seats, and that was something which safety authorities frowned on. So in the mid-70s, the cable car closed for refurbishment. And this is not a typical Wellington winter scene. It doesn't often snow, but I quite liked it. I think I've lived in Wellington for over 30 years, and I think it snowed about twice in the hills. It was turned into a fairly typical Swiss funicular, Harberger cars, meter gauge, single track with a passing place. So it really came into the 20th century with a bang, and is still a major tourist attraction. It's still operated by the city council, still owned by the city council. It's a major tourist attraction. You can tell when a cruise ship is in because there are queues all the way along the Lambton Quay part of the Golden Mile to get on it, and it operates without subsidy. Which is a good point and it's a bad point. It's a good point for us ratepayers, but it's a bad point that it means it's not part of Wellington's integrated transport network. So this is the trolleybus system at its maximum extent, final extent, but after the Roseneath routes. Sorry, can someone turn their microphone off, please? Thank you. After the Roseneath route and the Wadestown route and the ART Key route had closed, the last routes were the extension of the Brooklyn one to Kingston, which that S shape on the route heading south to the west of the picture, and the stub of the Newtown Park terminus. And it's remarkable that trolleybuses were still being extended into the late 80s. The fleet transformation as well. There were two sorts of Volvo trolleybus, the B58s, this is one, which were the main fleet, and there were the B10Ms, which we'll come to in a minute. This is Oriental Bay terminus. The wire to the right is the original trolleybus route up through to Roseneath and Hataitai. And this is a B10M. These were it's a opportunistic purchase by Wellington City Council. The Auckland had decided that they wanted a new trolleybus system to replace their old one. And they went as far as ordering equipment and ordering trolleybuses and having trolleybuses delivered. And then they decided they didn't want a trolleybus system. So all of a sudden, 20 brand new trolleybuses were available, whose value would be zero except to Wellington. So Wellington got a good deal with these. They were called Ansaldos. And to my mind, they were the finest trolleybuses that Wellington operated. I thought they were tremendous ones, but they didn't last long. They only lasted for about 10 years before service reductions meant that they were sidelined. But all of them, I think it was all of them, had a second life being converted into diesel buses and being used by other operators in Christchurch and in Wellington until not that long ago. And this is the sea end of Seatoon Tunnel that we saw in the first picture. And another Ansaldo together with a second batch of BUT with flat front. this is at Miramar, where the loop here was built in 1940 as part of, associated with the Centennial Exhibition. And then wholesale change. New Zealand, in common with much of the rest of the world, went into a neoliberal period, in particularly in economics, at the end of the 80s, when competition and privatization were good things and need to be encouraged. Privatization affected the trolleybus network significantly, and in my mind was a major reason why it closed. The council at the time owned the trolleybuses, owned the whole bus fleet that served everywhere except the northern bit of the city. And it also owned the cable car, and it also owned the local power supply, energy supplier. And what happened was that the trolleybus network was divided into 4 on disposal, because there was also the creation of a new set of bodies called regional councils, who were responsible for public transport planning and funding. So from the city council, the planning and funding function went to the regional council. The power supply, which was part of the municipal electricity department, the substations, went to an Australian firm, which later became, I can't remember what, it went through so many iterations, it's ridiculous. It's now owned by a Hong Kong company. Well, at closure, it was owned by a Hong Kong company. The vehicles and the depots were sold initially to Stagecoach, the Scottish conglomerate, and the overhead wires and the cable car were retained by the city council. The operation of the cable car was later contracted out, but has now been brought back in. So the trolleybuses became a sort of orphan. It wasn't obvious at the time, but it meant that there was no particular, the responsibility was divided between so many organizations, and they all had to be working in lockstep, and they weren't. At the same time, not quite at the same sort of time, electronic ticketing was introduced, which was done in an unusual way. There was no public money involved. It was purely it was the parent of the operator of the trolleybuses that introduced it entirely off its own bat, and which was rather a fine thing. We ratepayers and taxpayers didn't pay anything towards it. The problem was that since it was introduced by a bus operator, none of the other bus operators trusted them to operate it. So it never extended beyond the single operator until the regional council put lots of money in it. It now extends region-wide, but only temporarily, because it's all going to be replaced by a national system, which many people said should have happened in the first place, but some things happen eventually. Stagecoach took their trolleybus responsibilities seriously, and their cable car. They were one of the operators, early operators of the cable car, with the integrated network still there. And they built 3 prototypes based on with parts from the Volvos to renew the entire fleet. Those 3 trolleybuses are 2-axle ones. They didn't have autonomous traction facility. They didn't have any batteries, which is in common with the previous ones, whereas the later one, trolleybuses for the first time did have the ability to run off wire. And that's one of the last batch of fine trolleybuses, very fine trolleybuses, at the Lyall Bay terminus, one of the more scenic trolleybus termini, I would suggest, with its 3 axles and the Go Wellington branding of the New Zealand firm infratil. But then what else happened in the early 2010s was that the regional council, in its new, well, by then it was no longer new, planning function, said that the trolley buses would not be funded beyond 2017. That didn't really sink in at the time. It was 3 years away. A lot of things can happen in 3 years, and in many ways, it didn't make economic sense. There were these trolley buses still with a good few years' life left in them, which were useless anywhere else. The last right-hand drive trolley bus fleet in the world, you can't do much with the vehicles that are surplus from that. The regional council itself had funded significant overhead wire improvements. At the time of closure, the overhead system was officially described as being in the best condition it had been for 30 years. So those two bits of the organisation were doing pretty well. However, the third player, the power supply, wasn't. They weren't interested, and said that the substations were unsafe. Now, in this day and age, it's hard to argue with owners of facilities who say they're unsafe. But if you want to make them safe, you can buy them from us for $50 million. So the fate of the trolleys was sealed, despite lots of efforts. It would have been possible to preserve them under the new structure, which I'll come to in a minute, but nothing happened. The new structure was another part of privatization, commerciality, competition. The national government, the Conservative government, set up a new public transport operating model on which the main emphasis was commerciality. And part of that was that the regional councils had divided their systems up into units of routes. And the units that affected the trolley buses, there were two of them, one operating basically on the east-west routes and one operating on the north-south routes. But a key feature was the north-south route also included routes to the north of the city centre, which had never been trolley buses. So that obviously raised a question mark. The east-west route could have supported a trolley bus route if the political winds had been blowing in the right direction, but they weren't. So on the early hours of the 1st of November 2017, the driver pulled down the poles of a right-hand drive urban trolley bus for the last time anywhere, which was pretty sad. You will recall the crowds at the scene of the last tram. You will notice the distinct absence of crowds in suburban Kilburney at 1 o'clock on a spring morning. It wasn't really an event. As the tram went through the city centre, people were saying, "Oh, what's all the fuss about?" We were saying, "Well, it's the last trolley bus." Saying, "Oh, yeah." The story of what happened since is that the Infratil, the owners of the trolley bus network, were left with a large fleet with which, as they said, they could do nothing. So there was a lot of talk about converting trolley buses to electric buses or hybrid buses, and this was a success story. These are the two are the same vehicle, and it's no longer in normal commercial service operated by NCS, who aren't a operator of Wellington buses, basically a private hire fleet. But in that particular picture on the bottom right, it is actually operating on a public transport service because it's replacing the train behind. An aside, but just a few other complication. The train operation was also privatized, and now that's operated by Transdev, the French company. So multinationals galore. There was another much vaunted project to turn trolley buses into gas turbine hybrids by an outfit called Wrightspeed, founded by a New Zealander who was also one of the co-founders of Tesla. This was promised much, and it was a perfect example of the old adage, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, because it was. This got absolutely nowhere. It got buried. They refused to discuss it. It was apparently the company still exists, but this was a complete waste of Infratil's NZ Buses funds. Fortunately, there was no public money involved. And what happened to the rest of the trolley buses? Well, this is 30-something of them sat in a field in the Wairarapa. They were sold. They were sat around in Kilbirnie Depot for some considerable time. They have all been sold, and they were on sale for $10,000 each. So now, if you're in dire need of a right-hand drive trolley bus, I'm sure that offers would be accepted, because otherwise they're sitting there doing nothing, and I'm pretty sure they are still there, sitting there doing nothing. So the public transport infrastructure, and we get to the present day, big blank, apart from the cable car and 2 e-bus chargers. Put in both the 2 companies, separate companies, won the 2 main contracts in Wellington, and they both introduced e-buses. This is run by a firm called Transurban, who are a New Zealand operation, and that's the charger at Island Bay. The stick comes up at the back into the receptacle at the top. They initially started with small pantographs on the top, but they discovered that the propensity of New Zealand roads to have low-hanging trees and low-hung wires meant that the pantographs didn't last for very long. And the other operator had these CRRC. That previous bus was a CRRC double-decker with a QE bus builder's body. These are on this company is the NZ Bus, which is the successor to the trolley bus operating company. This is the high priority bus route on the east-west spine, which is nearly. They say it's completely electric, but it's almost completely electric. As we just saw, one of the initiatives was to introduce double-deckers because of their increased capacity. No one seems to have particularly considered their dwell times, but also the road infrastructure was sometimes a bit lacking, and the red and yellow chevrons on the bus stop just beside the left-hand bus are there to warn a double-deck bus driver that if they pull into the bus stop, they will demolish their top deck on that pole. And more recently, there's Yutong Electrics on the service to the airport, and these are operated by a third operator, Transdev, who also operate the trains. And Transurban showed some initiative too. These 2 are the same buses. This is a same bus, spot the difference competition. The main difference is that the top bus is diesel and the bottom bus, the same one, is electric. The fuel filler has disappeared from behind the rear wheel. The vent sort of changed in the back. And another much more momentous in terms of passenger response is the top one has got blue internal lights, and people hated blue internal lights. So the bottom one has now got white internal lights. These are CRRC buses as well, again, but diesels. And it was converted, the one conversion done by Transurban in its own workshops, which was supposed to be a success, but there haven't been any others appearing. And the cable car was also being redeveloped, a new station at the top. And one of the things that Wellington has been obsessed with in recent years, I think the obsession is rather wearing off now, is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, film trilogy, where mostly filmed in New Zealand, in Wellington in particular. And this is in the cable car station. This model is apparently a Knight of Rohan. I don't recall what a Knight of Rohan is, but anyway, Lord of the Rings stuff for you. And a rather lovely thing is the illumination of the cable car tunnels. These are moving patterns, and in the tunnels leading up from the city centre, and they're lovely. They're really nice. It makes travelling by public transport a really pleasurable experience. So there is a project called Let's Get Welly Moving, which is going through a difficult phase. It's spending lots of money and not achieving very much. And it's currently, well, it's not quite on life support, but it's not far off it probably. One of the projects they're looking at is what they call mass rapid transit, and to the south and perhaps to the east. This is dependent on housing densification, where there's lots of land, well, some land to the south and potential. To the east, it's a bit more difficult because it's lower lying. As you'll recall, those isthmus was created only a few hundred years ago, and susceptible to liquefaction from earthquakes as well. So densification is more likely to happen to the south than to the east. And they're proposing, the preferred option currently is light rail, but there's a huge number of people who say light rail is a waste of money, not understanding the capacity implications. So whether this has happened by 2040, I don't know, but I suspect I'm not going to live to see anything substantial happening. Not this, which is the what it's supposed to be looking like, an artist's rendering of what it's supposed to be looking like at the railway station. So what's left of the various systems? What left of the trolleybus system? There's a lot of poles left, which are recognisable by their plates where they still exist. K means it's on the Karori route. And this one is actually serves a particular function. It's a memorial to a photographer called Marcus Lang, who took a lot of pictures of trolleybus related stuff, which we'll see in a minute. But it's also close to a wildlife sanctuary, which is close to the centre of Wellington, which is called Zealandia, whose ambition is to, as a 500-year project, to turn that bit of New Zealand back into what it was like before human occupation. An astonishingly ambitious and so far pretty successful operation. One of the signs of success is the increase in the number of native birds. And the bird at the top of the pole is a sculpture of a kaka, a native parrot, who are raucous, active, sort of teenagers of the bird world. And they've become so successful that they in many places they're being seen as a pest, but of course the real pest isn't them. But this is an example of the sort of picture that Marcus took, a bit nerdy, but important details for people who are interested in those important details. That's the wiring in the city centre at the intersection of Wakefield Street and Taranaki Street. There's a trolleybus depot surviving. purpose built by the city council, multi-purpose, because those are council flats on the top. It's still in use by New Zealand Bus as a depot for their diesel buses, and those poles are old traction poles. But that's about all from the trolley buses. From the trams, there's very little in the way of official recognition. This tram point lever cover near Courtney Place has survived and is thought to be of sufficient interest to the city council's put a plaque on it. It is a sufficient interest, but it's hardly anybody knows it's there. It's a bit mundane, but the tramway was really important in the establishment and development of Wellington City, as we've seen. Another one is that there are several of these tram shelters surviving from the early days of the tramway, but not including this one, because this one was rather ironically demolished by a bus, and the local residents clubbed together and organised for the Polytechnic students to build an accurate replica, acknowledged by the plaque there, which shows that that sort of heritage is still an active consideration for many people, as does this. This is a recent mural on Oriental Parade, which you may recall was the first tram route to close way back in 1950. But this mural was done last year or the year before, which is not a bad representation of a fiducia tram. In front of the houses in front of which the actual mural is. To the right of the tram, there's the green framed windows, and above the tram is the green framed windows of the actual house. And there are several murals of trams around the place, so they still exist in concept anyway. There's this building still saying Wellington Corporation Tramways proudly on its frontage near the railway station. It's rather suffered from modernisation. It looked rather better when it was built in 1908, but it's still there. And the tunnels, all the tunnels are still in use, the ones built with trams in mind, even by double deckers. Now the left-hand picture, you think, is it going to make it? It's got those white and green hit sticks each side of the entrance. So if the bus isn't on the correct line, it makes a hell of a noise and demolishes those posts without damaging the vehicle, fortunately. There's the line of cat's eyes through the tunnel, and the lines painted on the surface. If the driver sits on top of the right-hand line while driving through, they're going to be all right. When you're approaching it on the top of a double-decker bus, you feel you want to take your hat off. But I'm not aware of any significant incidents that have happened since then. A couple of double-deckers have driven into single-story doors at bus depots, but that's another story. And also the road layout, apart from the significant road earthworks, tunnels, retaining walls, which I'm sure most people don't associate with the tram network. At the top here, where it says Mount Victoria Food Market, was what would be a crossroad, a normal crossroads, except that there's a sweeping curve. And below, where it says Bridge Associates, there's a sweeping curve back the other way. That's because that's where the tram route to the eastern suburbs went. And that at the bottom right, where it's the bus stop signs beside Pyro Street, that's where the entrance to the Tai Tunnel is. So what's there in terms of vehicles? Well, there's not too many places you can drive a right-hand drive trolley bus, but there are two Wellington networks that still have Wellington buses running. The first is in Ferrymead in Christchurch, which is a wonderful place to go. Apart from the trolley buses is actually a rather minor part of the setup with the steam railway, preserved electric railway. Now there aren't many electrified heritage railways. A tramway village, and all sorts of other things. Well worth a visit if you're in Christchurch. The other place you can ride on a Wellington trolleybus is back near where the trolleybus was born. Number 82 was first tested on the streets of Walsall in the West Midlands and is now back at Sandtoft, displaying proud British trolleybus heritage. And the Omnibus Society in Wellington has quite a number of trolleybuses, including, remarkably, the body from number 1, which is still there. Excellent stuff. Similarly, there aren't many places where you can drive 4-foot gauge trams, but there are 2. The Capitale Coast Electric Tramway, which is the Wellington Tramway Museum that we talked about before the presentation started, has a large fleet, a large successful fleet. International coach parties go there. It's a highly professional operation, well worth a visit. And Motat in Auckland, which is a publicly funded museum, has a dual gauge tram line between its 2 main sites. And the picture shows a 4-foot gauge fiducia followed by a standard gauge W from Melbourne. So go for a ride. The cable car, also, there's a museum for that. This is the original haulage mechanism, which is still there, preserved. The whole thing was modernised when the became a pure funicular, with a preserved car number 3, which has been preserved remarkably. One of the surprises being that it was originally green rather than standard red. Excellent restoration job, and lives in print. These highly recommended. All of these, particularly the Graham Stewart books at the top left about the electric trams and steam cable and horse trams, and Sean Miller's book on trolleybuses, and the Graham Stewart's book on the surviving trams, all excellent value. There isn't a history of a full history of Wellington trams or trolleybuses. There are the booklets at the bottom produced by the Wellington Tram Museum, which are excellent, but perhaps there ought to be. So with a shot of the last trolleybus entering the depot under autonomous power, so it was been an EV rather than running as a trolleybus, I'll conclude this with thanks to Henry Britton, in particular to Henry Britton, to Mike McKeon, to Alan, who produces Under the Wires, to the National Library of New Zealand and the Wellington City Council archives, and to websites of the various operators and the museums for the information which I've happily gleaned from them, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions. Thank you.